A peaceful day turned into a nightmare when a group of fake HOA security officers harassed my pregnant wife, Emma, and crossed a line by shoving her. Their cruelty was inexcusable, bullying an innocent woman just trying to park in front of our own home. But in that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I called in the SWAT team, and their world came crashing down. But just wait until you hear how this story unfolded and how justice was finally served. It was supposed to be one of those perfect mornings, the kind where everything falls into place. Emma, 8 months pregnant, and I had just settled into our new home. The boxes were still scattered around, but we had finally made it. We were starting fresh. I just stepped out to grab a coffee when I saw them, a group of men in ill-fitting uniforms standing near the curb. They looked more like disgruntled rent-a-cops than anything official. Their badges gleamed in the morning sun, but their demeanor was anything but reassuring. They were here to make sure we followed the rules. One of them stepped forward, a man with a pinched face and an air of self-importance. He approached Emma, who was sitting in the front seat of her car checking her phone, probably just as confused as I was. "Ma'am, you can't park here," he said, pointing to the spot directly in front of our house. "It's against the HOA rules. Move your car." Emma, still adjusting to the change and, honestly, not knowing all the local rules yet, tried to explain. "I'm sorry, I'm still getting settled in. I'll move it soon." But he wasn't having it. "It doesn't matter," he barked. "Move it now, or we'll take action." Before she could respond, the man shoved his hand onto the car door, trying to force it open. That was when it happened. Emma, 8 months pregnant, wasn't expecting it. She lost her balance, stumbling backward and catching herself on the side of the car. I saw it in slow motion, the way her hand gripped her belly instinctively as if trying to protect the baby. Something snapped inside me. I'd been calm for so long, the kind of person who took a step back and thought before reacting. But this was different. This wasn't just some random encounter. This was an attack on my family. My first instinct was to rush to her side, but when I saw her face, pale and scared, the anger overtook me. I turned and headed straight for the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what I had to do. I didn't even stop to think. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling from the adrenaline surging through me. "Get the SWAT team to my address," I ordered, my voice colder than I'd intended, but I couldn't help it. Every muscle in my body was tense with fury. "I don't care who you have to call, just get them here now." I could hear the confusion in the operator's voice as she tried to process the request, but I didn't have time for explanations. "Do it," I snapped. I hung up before she could ask another question. I was no longer thinking straight. All I could see in my mind was Emma and that man's hand on her, shoving her like she was nothing. I was going to make sure they understood the weight of what they had done. This wasn't just about a parking spot. It was about something far bigger than that. Something I couldn't and wouldn't allow to slide. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about my wife. It was about standing up to bullies, standing up for what's right. I couldn't stop now. The sound of sirens pierced the quiet morning air as the SWAT team descended, their vehicles skidding to a stop with perfect synchronicity. The men in the fake HOA uniforms, those so-called security officers, didn't even have time to react before they were surrounded. They didn't stand a chance. The team moved swiftly, the whole thing happening in the blink of an eye. One by one, the officers were cuffed and shoved into the back of police cars. They were stunned, but I could hardly bring myself to care about them at that moment. I was still consumed by what had happened to Emma. I turned to her as the chaos unfolded around us. She was sitting on the curb, her face pale and drained of color, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach. I could see the tremors in her hands as they clutched her belly, her every movement slow and deliberate, like she was afraid of doing something wrong. But it wasn't her fault. None of this was her fault. The anger that had driven me to call the SWAT team earlier now felt like a distant thunderstorm, a storm that had been brewing for too long and was still waiting to break. But this was different. This was raw. This was real. I walked over to her, my heart pounding in my chest as I knelt beside her. I reached out, my hands shaking as I placed one on her shoulder. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, her breathing shallow and uneven, and I could feel her pulse racing beneath my fingers. "Emma," I said softly, my voice breaking the silence, though I wasn't sure how to comfort her. I was just as shaken. "Emma, are you okay?" She slowly turned to face me, her eyes glassy with fear and exhaustion. I saw the tears that had started to well up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. She didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, but it was clear she wasn't okay. I didn't know what to do," she whispered. I couldn't even protect him." My stomach tightened as the reality of the situation hit me harder than before. It wasn't just about the shove. It wasn't just about her being shoved to the ground or how she'd barely caught herself. It was about the look of terror in her eyes, terror that wasn't just because of what had happened to her, but because of the little life growing inside her. She wasn't just hurt physically, she was terrified for our child. And that terror, I could see it in the way her hands hovered protectively over her stomach, as if she thought it might not be enough. She was scared. We were both scared. And that was what tore me apart. I wanted to rage, to scream at the world, but more than that, I needed to fix this. I needed to make sure that those men who had thought it was okay to treat my wife like that, understood the gravity of what they had done. This wasn't just a case of abuse of power. This was a violation that hit closer to home than anything I'd ever experienced. I wasn't just angry anymore. I wasn't looking for revenge either. I needed them to pay for what they had done to her, to us. They needed to face the consequences, not just because of the pain they had caused her, but because this wasn't something anyone should have to go through. As I held her hand, my thoughts turned cold and hard. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface was now boiling over, and I couldn't walk away from it. I couldn't forget what had just happened, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew this. No one would hurt Emma or our child again. Not if I could help it. Not while I was still standing. The cold, sterile interior of the police car felt more like a prison than a place of safety. The engine hummed quietly as we drove, the sounds of the outside world muffled by the thick windows. But inside, despite the quiet, the tension was palpable. My mind raced as I stared out the window, barely registering the city streets passing by. I hadn't said much since we left the scene, and neither had Emma. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, her body still in shock. Her hand rested lightly on mine, the weight of it grounding me in a way nothing else could. She hadn't pulled away. That alone meant something. She was holding on, not just to me, but to hope, however faint it seemed. She turned her head toward me, her eyes tired but clear. The shadows under her eyes seemed deeper than before, but there was something else there. Something that hadn't been there earlier. A spark. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" she asked, her voice quiet, yet determined. Her words were simple, but the weight they carried was unmistakable. I looked at her then, and for the first time since it all started, I felt a moment of peace. There was no more question of what I had to do. It wasn't about the anger anymore. It wasn't about getting even. It was about something bigger, something that went beyond just us. "No," I replied, my voice steady, though inside I could feel the fire still burning. Only now it was focused, channeled. "This is just the beginning." She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around mine as if she knew exactly what I meant. She didn't need to ask me to fight. She was already right there with me, and that gave me a strength I couldn't have imagined before this moment. This wasn't just about us. Not anymore. I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes for a moment, as the weight of it all settled in. The injustice, the fear, the violation of our right to live without being bullied by people in positions of authority who didn't care about the real consequences of their actions. It wasn't right, and it wasn't something we could just walk away from. Not when people like those officers still roamed freely, abusing their power without hesitation. But there was a new feeling growing inside me now. It wasn't just the anger that had burned hot in my veins before. This was something different, a sense of purpose, a resolve that I couldn't shake. I would not rest until this was made right, not just for us, but for every single person who had ever been mistreated, belittled, or pushed around by someone with the power to do so. I turned my head back to Emma, her face softening as she looked at me. There was a small, almost imperceptible smile on her lips, the kind that came not from relief, but from something stronger. "Do you think we can stop this from happening to anyone else?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't need to think about it. I knew. "We will," I said, my voice full of quiet conviction. "We'll make sure it never happens again." We sat there in silence for a while, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence filled with understanding, with strength, with the knowledge that what had just happened wouldn't define us, but what we were about to do would. This wasn't the end. This was our beginning. We would make sure that no one else would ever feel the way Emma had felt today. We would stand up, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who had ever been bullied by authority. This was no longer just a personal fight. It was a fight for justice, and I wasn't going to let it go. Not for anything. Not for anyone. The months that followed felt like a blur, but every moment was marked by a quiet sense of victory. The storm had passed, and the community was forever changed. We had become symbols, not just of resistance, but of the power of standing up when everything seemed impossible. The HOA, those so-called security officers who had tried to exert control over our lives, was dismantled. The local authorities had finally acted. The officers who had crossed the line were facing charges, and the town that had been silent for so long now found its voice. It was a voice of strength, of defiance, and of justice. And it echoed louder than anything those officers had ever expected. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window, watching the sun begin to dip behind the horizon. It was a quiet evening, the kind of peaceful night we'd fought for. Emma was beside me, her hand resting gently on her belly, a soft smile playing at her lips. Her expression was calm now, but I knew the depth of the journey we'd both gone through. It wasn't just the victory that mattered, it was everything that had led to it. "We did it," she said, her voice steady, but there was a weight to the words. It was a quiet triumph, but it meant more than anything I'd ever done. "We did," I replied, my voice full of the kind of satisfaction and that only comes from knowing you fought for something bigger than yourself, something that mattered not just for you, but for everyone else who had ever been silenced or overlooked. The victory was more than the dismantling of an HOA. It was more than the legal consequences for those officers. It was about the people who had rallied behind us, the neighbors who had felt powerless but found strength in our stand. It was about the courage that had sparked something far greater than a single fight. It had ignited a movement. We hadn't just fought for our own peace. We had fought for the peace of everyone who had been pushed down by authority, everyone who had been told their voice didn't matter. And now, we were part of something bigger. We were part of a community that refused to be trampled, a community that had found its strength in unity and in justice. I looked at Emma, and her smile grew a little wider, her eyes reflecting something I hadn't seen before, pure, unshakable pride. "You know," she said, her hand gently caressing her belly, "we didn't just win for us. We won for the baby, too. We showed them that when you fight for what's right, there's nothing that can stand in your way." Her words hit me like a wave, and I felt the full weight of what we'd accomplished. We hadn't just won a battle. We had changed something. We had left a legacy of justice and integrity, one that would endure for years to come. And that was the real victory. The victory was in the way the community had come together, in the way that people had found their courage to speak out. The victory was in the way that, even after everything we'd been through, Emma and I were stronger than we had ever been. We had fought for a better future, not just for our family, but for every family that had ever faced injustice. As I looked at Emma, our future stretched out before us, full of possibilities. We were no longer just fighting for survival. We were fighting for something bigger, something more meaningful. The triumph wasn't just in the end of a battle. It was in the beginning of something far more powerful, a movement, a change, and we had been at the center of it all. "We won, didn't we?" I asked, my voice low but full of awe. "We did," she whispered back, her hand resting on her belly once more, the smile on her face a quiet promise that the fight for justice was never truly over. It would always be a part of who we were, a part of who our child would grow up to be. And for the first time in a long time, I felt peace, not just for us, but for the future we had made.